society. These public programs broaden the work we do upstairs in our program exhibit spaces, the Civil Rights Room and the Votes for Women Room, where we inspire students of all ages, plus members of corporations, faith, and community-based organizations with stories of Nashville's rich civil rights history and the fight women continue to wage for equality and equitable treatment in this country. We engage them and visitors from all over the world in meaningful conversations about our past and connect the dots to the present to look at why we still seem to be fighting many of the same battles today. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Don't forget to validate your parking tickets at our front desk out here. There's a little white box out there with a slot to insert the ticket in, put it in, and the machine will print a barcode on the ticket for you. Also, following the Q&A portion of this evening's panel, we'll have a reception upstairs on the second floor mezzanine. So please make your way upstairs when we are done. The panelists will meet us up there, and maybe you can snag a photo. Now, let's get to the reason why we're here tonight. In June 1972, President Richard Nixon put pen to paper and signed the Educational Amendments of 1972 into law. Tucked into its final pages, a heading appears, Title IX, Prohibition of Sex Discrimination. It reads, "No person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance." These 37 words would change the world for girls and women across the United States. On its face, Title IX legally guaranteed an equal opportunity in education, but in time, Title IX would serve as the tipping point for the modern era of women's sports. Slowly but surely, women's athletics at the high school and collegiate levels grew to prominence, and Tennessee fast emerged as a national leader. Now, I'm going to introduce our wonderful panelists. Moderating this evening's conversation is Dr. Mary Ellen Pethel of Belmont University. Dr. Pethel is the author of Title IX, Patch Summit, and Tennessee's Trailblazers, 50 Years, 50 Stories. Marking the 50th anniversary of the passage of Title IX, Dr. Pethel interviewed and documented 50 Tennessee women whose careers shaped the national landscape for women's sports. The book is the first statewide compilation of its kind and offers a behind-the-scenes perspective of Tennessee women who dedicated their lives to the advancement of sport and gender equality. Dr. Pethel. Seated in the center here, Chattanooga native Teresa Phillips is a 5-time Hall of Fame inductee. She was the first black female athlete at Vanderbilt University, playing basketball for the Lady Commodores and later becoming an assistant coach. She was head women's basketball coach for both Fisk University and Tennessee State University. And during her time at Tennessee State, she also became the first woman to coach a Division I men's basketball team in February 2003. In 2020, she retired as athletic director for TSU after serving in that position for almost 2 decades. Teresa Phillips. And lastly, a native of Portland, Tennessee, Betty Wiseman has dedicated her career to advancing sports at Belmont University. In 1968, she founded the women's basketball program at Belmont, which became one of the first women's collegiate programs in the Southeast. She was named Coach of the Year 4 times, including once at the National Women's Invitational Tournament in 1977. She led her Belmont teams to several championships along the way to 248 victories, including wins over such notable programs as Alabama, Nebraska, North Carolina, Vanderbilt, and Tennessee. She's received numerous Hall of Fame and Lifetime Achievement Awards. Coach Wiseman. Now, without any further delay, I'm going to pass this on to Dr. Pethel. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I might stand up because the slides are going to be behind me, so that way I don't have to look quite as much over my shoulder. But could we go to that next slide? So thank you for that lovely introduction. And as you noted, you read the text of Title IX. And what you don't see in those 37 words are gender, sports, or athletics. I often say that Title IX is 9 pages from the end of a 150-page document, and that it reads a lot more like an update for an iPhone than it does the Declaration of Independence. But these words are going to signal the era of modern women's sports, but also the modern women's era of higher education as well. And I'll talk in just a bit about why we associate so closely women's sports with Title IX, but it was a rising tide that lifted all boats. So if you can go ahead to the next slide. So a little bit of context, as we've already mentioned, this was part of the Educational Amendments of 1972, and it passed overwhelmingly in the U.S. House and Senate. It was signed by President Nixon in June. And Title IX was about equal access and opportunity for girls and young women in public and higher education, any school receiving federal funding. And I argue in the introduction of this book that in the absence of the Equal Rights Amendment, that Title IX is one of the most significant pieces of legislation since the 19th Amendment. And you'll notice that the title of the book is quite long, but I wanted to make sure everybody knew exactly what was in it. Is that, yes, it's about Title IX. It's also about Pat Summitt, because Pat Summitt is a household name, and everybody that I interviewed had a Pat Summitt story, including me. But that it was about more than Pat Summitt, and that it was Tennessee's trailblazers and women like Betty and Teresa that really elevated this level of play in Tennessee. You know, Pat Summitt ends up getting the most recognition nationally, but she couldn't have done it without her fellow Marines, so to speak, who were all down in the trenches with her, including these women on the stage. So just quickly, a quote from Pat. Pat said, "3 events in 1972 changed everything for us. First, Title IX was passed as part of the educational amendments. Second, the International Olympic Committee announced that women's basketball would be an event for the first time at the 1976 Games in Montreal. And then third, the Association of Intercollegiate Athletics for Women, or the AIAW, was created to govern women's sports and host national championships, and this would be a decade before the NCAA. So it organized on the national level. But Tennessee had an advantage because they had organized 3 to 4 years before women's sports really got going on a national level, and that'll be the next slide. So in Tennessee, you had the Tennessee College Women's Sports Federation, or the TCWSF, that had its inaugural season hosting conferences and championships in 1969-1970. Then the AIAW starts a couple of years later, so it gives Tennessee a head start. The NCAA, as I mentioned, was hostile at first with Title IX, fearing that it was going to compete or undermine men's sports. But they did come on board in 1981 and 1982. But as a state, Tennessee emerged as a national leader. And I've already talked a little bit about Pat Summitt's role, but also the role of these women. And we're going to get to their stories and get a little behind the scenes action of what was really happening in those early days. Next slide. So as I've said, why Tennessee? And I'm going to give you 2 reasons before we get to the modern era. But this is a picture of the UT the first athletic department at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and you'll see a young Pat Summitt sitting in the striped shirt on the left, seated, and Gloria Ray there in the picture as well, the first athletic director, and Terry Crawford, the first track and field coach to win a national championship at the collegiate level. But these women, and these women on the stage, and future generations that would come along later, like me, and Gen X, and then millennials, and then Gen Z, none of that would have been possible without some of the really early trailblazers that are also included in this book. Next slide. One of those is the Tennessee Tiger Bells. The Tennessee Tiger Bells started running international competitions even when there wasn't a collegiate league. And these are names like Wilma Rudolph and Chandra Cheeseborough that you may have heard of. That's Wilma Rudolph top left, and that picture on the left with a gold medal relay team, and then Chandra Cheeseborough, who was an Olympian and gold medalist, but then was and still is the director of track and field at TSU. Tiger Bells are going to win Olympics medals at every Olympics from 1952 to 1984. They're dominant. They help lay the groundwork for women's sports in Tennessee. Next slide. And then secondly, the Nashville Business College, which was an amateur athletic union league, and that's what existed before you had collegiate basketball. And today we might think of the AAU as a high school league that you play in the off-season and in the summers, but at this time the AAU was a semi-pro, semi-collegiate league that had several teams around the nation, and one of those was here in Nashville. This was the sort of league of their own days, down to the satin uniforms. Probably the most consequential player to come out of the NBC was Nera White on the far left there, that Betty can tell you a story about her abilities, but Nira made a joke one time and said, you know that move that Michael Jordan made when he went up in the lane and then switched hands and then came up with the layup? She said, I was doing that in the 50s. Next slide.
She was.
And then before I bring in the featured speakers and special guests of the evening, I did want to mention Betty Giles, who is the matriarch of women's sports. She was the first president and the co-founder of that statewide league, the Tennessee College for Women's Sports Federation. She is 94 years young, still with us, and will be 95 in January. And she's going to start that league at UT Martin, and she's going to help bring Pat Summitt in. Pat Summitt played at UT Martin, and so Betty was one of her mentors. Without her, none of this would have happened. And she tells a funny story, and you can go to the next slide. Betty tells a funny story that she went to a PE conference, and she had all these female physical education teachers that said, hey, our girls are hounding us to play competitive sports because they only were allowed to play intramurals and field day type events, and wasn't intercollegiate, real competitive play. And so they all agreed that they wanted to form a league, and so they started meeting once a month at the Thunderbird Motel in Cookeville. And Betty always says that they would work on all the bylaws and committees during the day, and she's not here to defend herself, but that at night they would play poker and drink. And every time I tell that story on her, she denies it. So to get us into the main event here, I just want to mention some of the Middle Tennessee superstars. And these are people in Middle Tennessee that I've done a lot of book events with, but are not here tonight. We've got Carolyn Peck, who is coaching there with Pat Summitt, but she played at Vanderbilt University. There's Chandra Cheeseborough again with Tennessee State University. Harriet Hamilton with Fisk University and the volleyball team. And then on the far right is Tracy Calkins Stockwell, a swimmer who swam at Harpeth Hall and then was also an Olympian in 1984. And that brings us to our stars of the show. Next slide. And you've already heard the introductions of Betty and Teresa, but this is Betty's kneeling down. This was at the height of, like, pull your socks up as high as they'll go. And it doesn't look like a posed picture at all, does it? Totally natural stance. But there's Betty coaching, and then here on the left we see Teresa, and then this is Kathy Bender on the far left, two longtime teammates and friends. And so I'm just going to start with the usual first question, which is talking about getting into sports early in your childhood, especially because there weren't organized leagues in the same way that you would have today. How did you get into sports? What were your early stories and memories about sports and education?
I guess since I'm the oldest, I'll go first. Yeah? Wow, it's good to be here this evening, and thank you for coming, and we hope you give you some insights and some little stories that you will remember from this evening. But I grew up north of here in Portland, Tennessee on a farm. And I was a farm girl, and I liked everything about being outside and working with my dad. If I had to be in the house, then I was stymied. So there were no sports for girls then except for high school basketball, and even at that point, I knew nothing about it living out in the country. But when I was in junior high, which at that point was 7th, 8th, and 9th grades, 7th, 8th grade was junior high, and 9, 10, 11, and 12 was senior high. And so they organized a little junior high team when I was in the 7th grade, and I was the tallest person in my class from whenever I could remember, as far back as I can remember. And I remember playing on that little junior high team, and I'd never played before. And that basketball just became, it felt so good in my hands. And I was athletic and pretty tall, and so I had a good 7 or 8 games. We just put some games together. But then the next year, when I went into the 8th grade, which was still junior high, the high school coach came, and he had seen me play as a 7th grader, and there were no rules, so he took me every day to the high school, and I played 5 years on the high school basketball team. That was the extent of my growing up experiences in sports. That's all there was, and I was a good player and made all mid-state and things like that. And the picture that you saw of Nashville Business College was a AAU team, and they were semi-professional. They were champions in the United States, and they were world champions in women's AAU basketball. A lot of people have never heard of them, but they're really the beginning in Tennessee of women's basketball at an upper level. And so the coach came and saw me play during my junior and senior years, and I came when they played the Russians down at Old Municipal Auditorium. My parents brought me to see that game, and I was blown away, and I was enamored with Nera White. And Nera, as far back as I can remember in Tennessee, Nera White was the best female athlete I've ever seen in Tennessee. She played at Old Lafayette High School, and she's deceased now, and she was so good, played softball. They had a women's league here in Nashville, and she played softball, and I went to see her play because she was just the best female athlete I think I've ever seen.
Didn't you say she dunked?
And she could dunk the basketball. I went to see them play the Russians. My parents took me. I was in high school. So my dream, and she dunked that night. I mean, she was amazing. And I'm glad I knew her, because I think I know and have seen the best female athlete, one of the best in the world that I've ever seen. But I signed a contract to play with Nashville Business College because I thought that would just be amazing. And I had 30 days to break a contract, and I was still in high school, a senior. But I'd always wanted to be a teacher, because teachers in my life were most influential people in my life growing up. I thought, I want to give back. I want to be a teacher. And I had planned to go to Belmont College, a small Christian school at that point, and it was less than 400 students. And so I had 30 days to break that contract, and I went to Belmont to ask if I could go to Belmont, if I could be excused from classes. I must have been crazy. If I could be excused from classes and play for this national championship team. And the president, Dr. Gabhart, who would become my mentor in life, he listened to me as a 17, 18-year-old, and finally he said, "Betty, what do you want to do with your life?" And I said, "I want to teach and maybe coach in high school, whatever." And he said, "Well, you have a big decision to make, because you cannot be successful as a college student traveling around the country playing basketball and making everything work."
But that you didn't have an option to play basketball in college, and that was the choice.
Well, there's nothing. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
And so on the 30th day, I got out of the contract, and I went to Belmont College, which is Belmont University now, and that was the second most important decision I had made up to 18 years old, because it changed the course of my life. My first decision was to follow Christ, and so that's my story.
And you go as a freshman at Belmont, and then I want to let Teresa talk about her childhood getting up to Vanderbilt, but that was, you went as a freshman, and then Belmont would be where you would go to
Right.
school and then work for the next 50.
Yeah,
Or so
I was
years.
getting ready
She's
to
still
graduate.
working just for free.
Yeah.
I was getting ready to graduate from Belmont, and this same Dr. Gabhart called me in. I had not even applied for a job, and he said, Betty, I want you to stay on at Belmont and take over our health and physical education program and teach. You'll have to go to Peabody, get your master's degree, but you'll stay here this next year, and we have a job for you. You'll work on campus. And so the man who said no to me, when I needed somebody to say no to me, then he said yes. And the rest is history, and I'm still going to Belmont most days now. And I'm 80 years old, so.
Teresa, your journey to Vanderbilt was not very predictable. You had a lot of different things that happened, and even just a teacher's daughter who said she was going to Vanderbilt, and you thought that sounded good to you. How in the world did you get to Vanderbilt?
I just think that's how life is, though. You never can predict when circumstance happens or when you, our audience, are talking to a young person, what impact what you may say to them can have. Because I went to Vanderbilt based on my 8th grade Latin teacher telling the class that her daughter was at Vanderbilt and something she had to do for at Vanderbilt. I didn't even know what a Vanderbilt was. I had no idea that I couldn't afford to go to anybody's Vanderbilt, but I was in 8th grade, and I think I applied for that school out east a little bit because, it was a state institution, but that's the only school I really applied to go to was Vanderbilt, and it was from being a 14-year-old in the 8th grade Latin class. But Betty, man, we did have a few sports when I grew up, Betty. I mean,
Not 80.
yeah, that's not quite. No, I'm not, but I hope I look like you do when I'm 80, but, I was born up on Lookout Mountain, Chattanooga, had 2 older brothers. I still was born in 58, guys, so, I'm still not a spring chick, so girls who were interested in sports when I was growing up had a little nickname, and some of you older people may know, we were called tomboys. And so was it affectionate or was it a put down? It was kind of a backward slap somewhat. But I embraced it because I love sports, and I was just very fortunate that I had parents, although they were Black, Southern, Baptist parents, they believed in equality in our family. My brothers had to wash dishes, and, it wasn't any separation of what the boys did and what the girls did, except for there just weren't that many opportunities for girls when I was coming through as there were for my brothers, obviously. But I ended up being the athlete who went on to college and play. I was very fortunate. My mother was a domestic worker for a very wealthy family on Lookout Mountain, and it became time for me to go to junior high school, or whatever they called it back then, to 7th grade, and she asked my mom, hey, where is Teresa going to school next year? And her daughter was going to girls preparatory school, an elite school in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and my mother said, well, she wants to go to GPS, but she knows she can't, but I think I'm going to pay the money for her to take the test because she just wants to feel like she could prove she could get admitted in. Well, the next thing I know, I'm at GPS. This lady and her family and a foundation paid for me to go those 6 years, so I ended up being the second Black young girl, and we were girls then, to go to GPS. But I think that it changed a lot of my life. I was going to have a good life. I came from a great family, loving family, good people, high work ethics, Christian family, but going to that all-girls school really changed how I saw myself even. And I still believe that all girls, or all boys education, all girls especially, can be good, because when you're in that environment, You're not trying to be cute for boys. You're not trying to compete for boys. You're the leaders. The cheerleaders are cheering for you, not just, well, we might cheer for the girls' game and, the JV cheerleaders. So you are really promoted and pushed in leadership positions from being 12 years old. And I think that made a big difference for me in the 60s, early 70s. I think I went in 1970, graduated in 76. And it just showed me a different opportunity for myself, especially also coming from a lower income family. So I get to Vanderbilt, and I did get to play sports. I mean, the one thing about being at GPS, I learned how to play field hockey, soccer, swimming, tennis. I mean, you go to an all-girls prep school, you really were, they gave you all of those opportunities. And so it wasn't strange to me to believe that, we could, and then I got to Vanderbilt and found out they didn't have any women's sports that I could be a part of. I went there as a student first, not as an athlete. The opportunities just weren't there, and I was a big-time volleyball player in high school, but just the academic background that I got at GPS pushed me to go to the best academic school that I could have the opportunity to go to, and that was Vanderbilt.
When you said that there weren't any athletic teams, interestingly, so Title IX's 1972, Vanderbilt doesn't have its first varsity women's basketball program until 78.
77, 78, my second year there.
So Betty, it was interestingly, and just a couple of other facts too that and some context, Betty's starts the first really competitive program in the state, 1967, 1968, even before the foundation of the state league, and certainly before the national league. So the team that she formed at Belmont, when she got that job from Dr. Gabhart, she went in and said, can I start a team? And he, as you said, he said yes, but of course followed by what women's sports heard a lot, but we don't have any money. And so she was able to get uniforms, and Belmont did pay for uniforms and for travel. But the earliest known competitive collegiate program in the state of Tennessee. But high school, this is one other thing I wanted to say before we moved on, is that when y'all were playing high school basketball, it was a little different than today's game. Because if you don't know this, the women's basketball game used to be split into a half-court setting, and you could only play half the court because they didn't think women could handle the strain or the physicality of running full court, which Pat Summitt always said she thought was funny, considering the fact that she could throw, a bale of hay over her head onto a loading truck, but they didn't think she could run, 90 feet. So in some of the games that she would play, they would actually have her on defense, have her steal the ball, call a timeout, put her on offense, have her score, call a timeout, put her on defense, have her steal the ball, and they won several games that way. But the half-court game was something that was very different than something that both of you played, and any comments on that, and then I want to move us on.
Yeah, we were playing divided court, and I was a forward because I was tall and I could shoot, I could score. And I was always stymied with that line. You run up and get the ball. The guards would get the ball and pass it across that center line, and I just hated that center line. And I just remember my senior year, we had a new coach who came in, and he was coach of the boys, and he coached the girls too. And I kept saying, if I could just play full court. And he said, stay after school. And so from that day on, I practiced twice. I played with the girls, and I played with the boys. I practiced with the boys, and I ran up and down that court as many times as I could. And but when we started, I went into president's office when I first started teaching my first year, and 1966 I started teaching, but I went in and I gave him all this information that I had gathered and had a little speech, and I asked him to start a women's basketball team. And this is the same guy who said no, and then he hired me. And And he listened, and finally he said, Betty, I think you could do this. I mean, he knew me pretty well by then, right? He said, I think you could do this, but I don't have any money. And I said, Dr. Gabhart, you know, boy, have I heard that so many times. I don't have any money, but if you just give us enough to travel, just a short schedule this first year, buy uniforms, I will make it work. I will make it work. And I did. And actually, the first team was 68, 69. And it was like 2 years later, 4 years later, when Title IX came into being. That's when all the schools started.
And
teams.
that's part of my earlier point of why Tennessee, because you had people who were already elevating the level of play before you had a national league. So, you know, the level of play was increasing in high schools, it was increasing in colleges. And Teresa, I believe that at Vanderbilt, you could see a lot of differences even in the late 70s after Title IX had been around. Most schools started offering scholarships by 76, but even when you were playing, there were quite a few differences between the men's program and the women's programs. I'm just thinking about the boiler room.
Oh, wow. Again, my first year, we were a club sport. Second year, we became an intercollegiate team. And we got one set of uniforms. I'll never forget them, a black set of uniforms. We were so proud, no warm-up. I think my junior or senior year, we got a second uniform. But our locker room, guys, was the PE locker room. They did teach PE then, and I don't know, you had to take one PE class to graduate from Vanderbilt. So there's a little dressing room for the girls to change clothes or whatever. That was our locker room, too. And it was adjacent to the boiler room, so the steam and the heat from the boiler room would come over into the locker room. So, hey, I couldn't make this up. We had little locks. We had to put our own little lock on there because, of course, other people were using our locker room. And on game day, they put a big sign up. Closed, you know, get all your stuff, you know, not a woman's game, a girl's game is today. And so we were friends with the guys. That's what's so beautiful about sports. The male athletes are very supportive of women athletes from way back then until today, really. Within teams, people are supportive of each other. You don't deal with too much racism or anything inside. That's what makes sports such kind of almost ideal when you're in that locker room and you're on the bus, you're on the team. And so the guys, we knew they had wooden, beautiful lockers and locker rooms. We knew they were riding on nice coaches and the country music star buses sometimes. And we were in these 15-passenger vans that sometimes wouldn't have heat. I mean, literally, I drove a van back from Mississippi one time when our head coach got sick. He ended up having a flu when we got back, so he was pretty sick. And so one assistant coach was driving one van, he was driving the other. He was so sick, he couldn't even get on the van coming back. So they just said, well, Teresa, you're the oldest, here, you drive, you know. And so I drove the damn van back, you know. What kind of liability was that? You know, nobody said anything, nobody cared, you know. I just, you know, we did what we were having a hell of a good time, though. I'm telling you. I mean, I know they're on charter planes now, but I don't know if they had as much fun as we did on those vans.
Well, we had two old station wagons.
Yeah, you were station wagon.
Two old station wagons, and we had two players that traveled backwards.
Oh, yeah.
And both station wagons.
In the jump seat.
How
the
they
third row
did that,
jump seat.
I don't know. I don't know how they did that, but
Didn't they have to ride to Iowa like that, 12 hours?
We went to Iowa and played this AAU team. First game we ever played. That's the only people we could play. Yeah. We even played Nashville Business College because the coach was nice enough to give me a couple of games. Yeah. But that first game of our program in Iowa, we lost by 40 points. And you know what? I just said, what in the world have I gotten myself into? But let me tell you this, they had to return the game later in the season, and we upset them by 3 points.
Wow, way to go.
So that's how we began, with who we could play, wherever we could play, and it was a game, and we could play, and we had arrived.
And that's what so many people would say that I interviewed, is that they talked about how hard it was and sleeping on gym floors, and they had to actually take their own officials a lot of times, which also seems like, I mean, not maybe a liability in that sense, but, who would bring an official where, like, somebody from the Vanderbilt staff's refereeing the Vanderbilt game? That would seem a little weird, but they had to do that. And I had an interview with one of the women who was an official, Lucia Jones from UT Martin. She said their uniforms, they had to wear pantyhose when they were officiating. So,
Yeah.
but they would go through all of these incredibly tough and difficult circumstances, and yet their love for the game was always the thing that came through the most, how much they loved the game.
Yeah, but we didn't, it wasn't, we started in 68, 69, and it wasn't until 1980 that Belmont gave its first scholarship. Wow. 2 girls got full scholarships. And that was the beginning of
And you didn't get
scholarships
paid
for
for it
girls.
quite a while either.
And you know what? I didn't get paid for coaching. I just did that because I wanted to. I was a physical education and health teacher, and I loved it. I was committed to it and ran the intramural program. But, you'd come in maybe from a game, and you drive, you coach, you drive back, and I might sleep in the locker room because I had to teach an 8 o'clock class. But you know what? I'd do it all over again.
No, that's right.
Did it because they loved it. And they were talking earlier, I want to get to a little bit more of a serious subject, that women's sports didn't have to go through the same type of racial integration that men's sports did, especially with, we know that most of us here know the story of Perry Wallace, and we've got the author here, Andrew Meredith, that wrote that amazing biography. Integrating teams, women's sports, because they came of age in the 70s, operated a little differently in that respect, but it doesn't mean that there weren't really tough times and racism and discrimination on the road. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about your experiences with some of that.
Well, people ask me all the time, when did you recruit your first African American player? And I said, it was the first 2 players I recruited. I did not see color. We've had African American players, black players, from the very beginning of our team. And it was the second, I'll tell you a story. It was the second year we were playing. We were driving down through Mississippi to play Mississippi University for women. And the coach of that particular team played on this Nashville Business College team. And I had known her, so she gave me a game. But on the way down there, we stopped for lunch at just a little restaurant, more like a soda shop or whatever. And we went in, and I was sitting down, and players were kind of scattered out. It was a small place. There were several people in there. And I had my food. My table had food, and one of the players comes to my table and says, "Coach Wiseman, Matt and Pete and Shoma have not been served." And I said, "What?" So I get up and I go back to the table, and the girls, I said, "What's wrong, girls?" They said, "Coach, they're not serving us. They won't serve us." And I said, "Where's the waiter?" So I went to the waiter and I said, why aren't you serving this table? And she said, "We don't serve." She used the N word. And I said, "Where's the manager of this place?" By that time, I am so angry. And so he comes out, and I said, why aren't they serving that table? And he said, "We don't serve them here." And I'm telling you, I crawled up his stomach, and I put my fingers in his chest. I was just beating on him, and I said, "You are so wrong. This is wrong." And I'm going to tell you something. If you don't serve that table, you don't serve any of us. And I've got tears running down my cheeks, and I said, "You're going to pay for this someday. Someday this is going to be righted." I don't even know if that's a right word or what, but
It's appropriate.
I flew all over him. And I just turned around and I said, "Girls, let's go."
Yeah.
So we left all the food on the table, and the girls were looking at me. I mean, they thought I was going to kill him maybe, but I was so angry, and I was so sad at the same time. But I got the players to the van, and I pulled them in a circle, and I'm crying, and I took my black players, and I just loved them, and I said, "I'll always stand up for you. There is no difference. I want you to know this is family." And we all cried, and we got in the van without any lunch, and we went and played that game, and we won that game, and we had a hamburger coming home.
They went all out, and I tell this story in the book, and I say it was a moment of unconditional love, a chosen family bonded by sport and to one another. The team did not have lunch that day, but they won the game. In the end, an empty stomach is no match for a full heart.
Amen.
I think that
Beautiful.
describes it.
And I will say, I think that moment in time is the foundation of who and what women's basketball at Belmont University stands for today. And our coach and our players know that story, and they know that's a part of their history and heritage.
And Teresa, 10 years later, right?
10 years later, Mississippi is special, and I have a friend of mine is here tonight, and she spent, I don't know how many years in Mississippi, and she said she'd never go back because she spent time in California and New York and Detroit, and I don't know how she got stuck in Mississippi, but, and it's nothing. There are good people in Mississippi, but the same incident happened to us at Vanderbilt in Mississippi, but the manager did try to take our order, but our coach by then said, "Oh, no. And people were trying to grab, but now they were a little greedier because a couple of our teammates tried to grab a little piece of chicken on their way out. Like, they had already served us. I mean, we were talking, you're having fun. We had already played our game. We're having fun. We're waiting to be waited on. And so we're talking so much, we didn't even realize that nobody had waited on our table. I think it was one white player was sitting with us. She didn't get to eat either. And so that happened. But a worse one really happened at Mississippi State. When we had played a game at Mississippi State, I think Kathy Bender was on the team then, but Kathy had an illness. So I think a girl had gotten put off the team or something. Long story short, I was the only African-American on Vanderbilt's team that day playing down at Mississippi State. And so, and I couldn't shoot, I wasn't even that good a player, but that was like my best game, so I'll never forget that day. So we won, we're going through the little portal, and how many people were at the game in 78, but there were enough. And so some of the students had come over to the portal. You know how they usually are giving you five or trying to do stuff in the NBA or WNBA, but they were just coming to harass us on our way out. And so one of them yelled, "Hey, Teresa." So what is I look up and look at him. He spat at me. He actually spat at me. And I was like, he missed me, because if he had hit me, you all wouldn't be seeing Teresa up on the stage right now. I would have never gone any further probably than that. But I mean, my teammates just embraced me. I mean, they were trying to go up there and fight him and things like that. But and he did not use the N-word though, or I didn't hear him. But he did decide that it was worth spitting at me. And he called my name out. So he was trying to pick the African-American athlete on the Vanderbilt women's team to do something really nasty and vile to. So Perry Wallace, I can't even imagine what Perry Wallace actually had to endure in men's sports, being way earlier than this. playing in front of tens of thousands of folks who did not want to see a smart, young, and very capable student and athlete like a Perry Wallace out on the court in the SEC, in the dirty South, you know what I mean? And so that's why there's a book on his life. That's why there's movies and documentaries. That's why a street is named after Perry, because I know on the male side, because of the fan appeal, because of the money involved in sport, on the men's side especially then, the vitriol that he had to take probably was just multiplied so much more than what I would have experienced and what Betty had to experience as a coach, being supportive of her players.
And the timing of the women's era in the 70s and then especially by the 80s of the NCAA, I feel like it did, because the makeup of the teams was racially diverse from the beginning and having to endure some of those really horrible, difficult moments, it bonded these women's teams in incredible ways. And I know Rebecca was going to give me the signal for when we needed to go Q&A, but I think that's coming up. She left me. Oh, that means I get to do whatever I want. I want to have you both just comment on one thing, and then we will have a few minutes for Q&A. And that is, you know, I did an intro on Title IX, and we've talked around it a lot. You were able to do what you were able to do and pass that on to other generations because of Title IX, because you both went into coaching, you both went into administration, and that's the piece we haven't really gotten to. Betty being the first senior woman administrator and assistant athletic director, female assistant athletic director at Belmont, and then Teresa coaching successfully at assistant at Vanderbilt, then at Fisk, then at TSU, and then moving into athletic administration, where you were 18 years, or was
19.
So, as the head athletic director of not just the women's programs, but both the men's and women's, and with a football program too. And so, just and I'll have you keep this quick so we can get Q&A. But just to comment on how you use Title IX or Title IX in your professional career, especially as administrators. I know, for example, Teresa, you talked about that you weren't necessarily a rebel. You didn't go in guns blazing, but you worked to build alliances and how you were able to work sort of within the system to try to achieve what you wanted to achieve.
Yeah, I think there's more than two ways to skin a cat, and so I think it's always been important to get advocates who are on the other side. You know, if you go back to the civil rights movement, the freedom riders, whatever you want to look at in this Title IX thing in women in sport, you have to bond and you have to collaborate and you have to, work with the men, to be honest. A lot of men really, back in the 80s and in the mid-90s, and when I went to Tennessee State, they had a fear that by embracing and supporting women's sports, they were going to take away from men's sports. And actually at Tennessee State, they actually did drop baseball, which I think was not a smart move on the part of the AD at that time, but I think he felt he didn't have the support above him, and he just didn't have, I think, the courage to put his foot down and say, no, we're not dropping men's sports to support women's sports. We just need to start supporting women's sports. But one of the things that I think I did at Tennessee State quite well was to have the men believe in it, to have our men's, our alums, our supporters, to believe that women's sports had value, and sometimes you had to tread lightly with that.
And build alliances. That's
build
right.
Alliances.
I would, just like to note too that it really is the. We're talking about women's sports, but there were a lot of male allies that were out there.
Teresa,
like
I grew up in a man's world, and teaching and coaching. And when I first started coaching, I went to basketball clinics to learn how to coach, and it was me and the guys. And I was never mistreated. Men, I was blessed. At Belmont and surrounding areas, and even at UT, I went up here to learn 1-3-1 zone defense from, what was the coach up there? Ray Mears. I wanted to, because nobody ran it but him. But anyway, all that to say is that I was never ostracized by men. They respected me, I think, because they just respected a woman who was willing to do what I would do. And
Without pay sometimes.
without pay, and most of them didn't know I wasn't getting paid, but that's okay. But let me say one thing about Title IX. Title IX, we as a program never thought about what we did not have. We were just happy to have a program. That's where I come from. And I was in a Christian school, a church-related school, and we didn't get federal funds until the late 70s. And so I wouldn't change anything, because I'm a better person for having gone through all that. Yeah. And I think my players are too. They know, my players and your players too, know where you came from. And they know what they have now as a result of people of the past.
But that is the timeliness of this 50th anniversary too, because a lot of college athletes, it's been long enough that they just know that they sit through some Title IX compliance meetings, and you know, they don't understand necessarily their place in the larger history. And this anniversary and hopefully this book is going to help them realize where they fit into that longer arc of history. I can say for my part, and if you want to go to that last slide, and we'll get to Q&A if we have a little bit of time, but you know, if you want to see if Title IX is working, just a few stats. There's 1 in 27 girls playing sports in 72. Today, that's 1 in 3. 94% of all female executives have played organized sports, according to a study in 2018. 58.4% of Team USA's medals in the Tokyo Olympic Games were won by women, but 75% of the gold medals were won by women. So this is what you see when you see that we started with baby boomers, and then we went to Gen X, and I was in that generation, and then millennials. And Gen X is where you see the 1996 Olympics with all the different teams, right? And then now we're in Gen Z. So that's why it's important to tell these stories, because you can't expect Gen Z to know what the baby boomers did all those years ago. And so you can look at these stats. And Rebecca, will you want to have time for a few questions, and then we'll wrap it up.
Does anybody have any questions?
I have a question for Miss Teresa.
Hi, how are you?
When that guy spit on you, right?
Mm-hmm. So
you just walked away. Spit at you, right?
Yes, sir.
You just ran away from him, didn't do nothing, you just left him?
You know, one of the things when someone does something that outlandish, you are momentarily in shock. And I think that's God's way of slowing you down from doing what you would do. And I had my teammates there, and it was very obvious what had happened. They knew, you know, that it was just really pointed towards me. And so I'm very thankful that I did not respond, that I did not, you know, try to run up in the stands and do anything. I've seen that happen one other time as a coach, and a fan spat at one of my players, and that was very difficult. I was at Fisk University, and she didn't have quite the attitude that I had, but the shock still was there for her. So, you know, it's just something that happened. You know, the world is still like that somewhat, and you know, you just got to be bigger than that. I'm not always like Michelle Obama. When they go low, I go high, but but that time I did. So thank you.
Thank you. Teresa knows me, but I want the panel to address the issue of one panelist indicated, well, I did it and I had no money and I wasn't paid. But now that you're looking at the 1 in 27 going to the 1 in 3, did the money proportionally to fund the difference, is that there, or is that still disparate? So did the dollars follow the women's sports participation to get them funded?
I've got a little bit on that. It's actually a sort of a twofold answer. On the one hand, you could say yes, because girls are playing sports younger, and then they're getting better at a younger age. But with that comes the business of sports, right? You're paying little league fees or rec league fees, the number of travel teams. I mean, it's an industry that kids are going from 5 to 18, and with that come greater family support and participation, bigger audiences, more people. So it has grown in that way and has helped with equity in that way, especially with exposure and with building an audience base for women's sports. Now, on the corporate side, Carolyn Peck, who you'll see in the exhibit upstairs, who was a Vanderbilt player, she currently works for ESPN, and what she'll tell you is, yes, things have gotten better, but if you look at the overall arc of media coverage in corporate media, like in ESPN, that in 1989, the amount of female sports coverage was 5.1% of all ESPN coverage, and in 2018, it was 5.4%. So that equity is not there, and what Carolyn Peck and Lynn Dunn and a lot of other people in the book have said is that is where they see the most room for growth, and that we need to find ways and alliances and to get more women at the table for those media contracts. I mean, did y'all see that 2 weeks ago, Nebraska volleyball team played in front of 92,000 people, and then last week Iowa played in front of 55,000 to watch Caitlin Clark? So that's that revenue stream is a real missed opportunity right now, and I hope that's something that we can address.
And I will say there's a lot of game playing with whether the women are making as much money as the men, because when you invest, where you invest is where money then is made. And if we're not, the NCAA, I was on the NCAA Women's Basketball Committee for 5 or 6 years, and of course a few years ago, it was really exposed when the Final Four at the men had this great fuel system, great workout equipment and all that stuff, and the women had a couple of yoga mats and a granola bar, and you're like, how in the heck did that? But this is the thing, if the NCAA wants to go to ESPN and negotiate TV rights for the championships, they have to do that for the women too. That's where the money is coming from, where the men are getting those huge shares. Of course, they have bigger crowds overall, but women sell out at the Final Four. They're in big football arenas maybe, but that's not where the money is. The money is with TV. And that's a choice that executives make, that presidents and ADs or whomever is negotiating those contracts are making. So that's there's no doubt that there's an interest in women's sports. If you can get 92,000 to come watch a volleyball game, come on now.
Well, and I'll just, I'll add to that and then I'll close. Any others? You want one more?
Sure.
Okay. So
So
just
two more.
this past year, 2 years ago was the first time that every NCAA women's basketball game in the tournament was on TV, just 2 years ago. And for the first time this past year, the championship was on ABC, not ESPN. So it was the first time it was on a major network. But that's where there is probably the most room for growth.
Not quite, but just you can talk louder.
In terms of equity, I guess in terms of sports and in terms of payouts on sports and what has to happen, I mean, all you have to do is look at Nashville, right? We have Major League Soccer, we have Major League Football, we have Major League Hockey, we have AAA baseball. They're all men's sports. We're talking about Major League Baseball, another men's sport, before we have our first professional women's sport in Nashville, Tennessee. Our
the SEC championship for women's basketball was here in Middle Tennessee, sold out, showed people will show up, and yet I think, like Teresa said, it's where corporate is investing, where other people are investing. And so I think that's where we've got to advocate for, is that if we don't have a team, we can't show. I mean, Taylor Swift, everybody said, oh, female performing artists couldn't do it, right? Till Taylor Swift told them they were so wrong, and then Beyonce and all these other, I mean, the big tours, it's a market.
Yeah, and I'm an advocate for women's basketball professional team to come here, and I was at the Nashville Sports Council last fall celebrating Title IX, and the last thing I said to them was, it's time for a professional women's team in the city of Nashville.
Yeah. Softball is the fastest growing sport, and Monica Abbott, who's in the book, said, she wanted to adopt the WNBA slogan of "We got next," because softball is like, man, that is the largest, fastest growing sport for girls, and yet there's still not a great place for them to go beyond college. There's not that professional. There is a professional league, but not nearly as lucrative as a partnership that you would have, because it's the WNBA and the NBA together.
Good evening. I'm a longtime friend of Teresa Phillips, and I congratulate all three of you women up there. Thank you so much for all you all have done. Just have a quick question, because Teresa and I entered Vanderbilt together, so we have been friends since 1976. And I tried to play with her on that club level team that first year we were at Vanderbilt, but they wouldn't let me come to the intercollegiate part. Teresa, I just want to say, I know they say that records are made to be broken, but I think one of my most exciting and proudest moments was that game, that men's Division I basketball game that you coached. I think we went to Clarksville at Austin Peay. But I don't think I've ever asked you, how do you feel about that? And what do you feel that that's a milestone that'll ever come about again? That's my question.
And Kim, that's a good question.
It wasn't the
And
happiest.
as much time as we spend together,
I've never heard you speechless before.
Well, it wasn't the best circumstance.
It wasn't the best circumstances, and so that would probably be a thing that I've done in my life that if I could go back and erase doing it, that I would. Actually, yeah. It was under difficult circumstances. It was circumstances that were embarrassing to our institution. I think given the set of circumstances, me coaching the game was the best thing for me to do. Never thought that it was making history or that this notoriety would be placed on it. I think because our head coach, who was involved in the incident that had to be set down, had a famous name. He was the son of a very famous men's basketball coach who had won a national championship at the University of Arkansas, and they shared the same name. I think that brought it some national attention. Well, it was an OVC game. I could have gone down to Clarksville, coached the boys. I just finished coaching and retired from coaching the women. So no one in the OVC would have been very surprised that Teresa's coaching the team. All the coaches are suspended. But it became a huge fanfare. But we're in the state with the most famous women's basketball coach in history of women's basketball, Pat Summitt, who was still in her, heyday. She was still winning national championships, or trying to at that time. So me being the first woman to coach the men, that was not an accurate statement. I happened to coach that game. And also, I will say, on our campus, Katana Starks was a female coaching a male sport. She was coaching golf and had coached swimming at Tennessee State already. So when people think there are these firsts, when you really look back at history and look and know your history, you'll know a lot of women have done some of these things before. It just wasn't, made public.
When
You
Teresa,
probably coached the men over there at Belmont, we just don't know.
when Teresa and I talked about that,
See, she winked at me, she probably did.
when we talked about that situation, you mentioned Katana Starks, and that's what I think I'd end with is just a couple of last notes, and I'll turn it over to you, Rebecca. One is that I started off. This was my COVID project, and when I had the idea, and I realized, well, it takes about 2 years to write a book, and I've got about 2 years before the Title IX anniversary. And then when COVID happened, I thought, well, I can't do it. There's no way I can do it because I have to interview mostly women over 65 in person. And then what happened is that COVID accelerated our collective learning curve for things like Zoom and Google Meet, and it actually allowed me to expand the book project. I was starting off, I was going to do 15 to 20 women, and then, I started hearing about women I'd never heard of, like Katana Starks, who she mentions, who's in the book, and so many others. Judy Eller Street. I could go on and on. Their audiobook coming out, by the way, in November. But then once I hit like 42, 43, I was like, well, I am competitive after all. We've got to get 50 for 50 years. And so I'll just end with this because this is the last official event I have on my calendar for this book. It was released a year ago next week. And so these two women here, and I told them backstage, and we had a group hug, and I came up to their waist, and I said they're like my power forwards. They have done more events with me over the last year, and the greatest blessing out of all of this is that I wanted to tell stories of the unsung heroes that had never gotten the credit that they deserved, but I ended up making a lot of really good friends, and these two chief among them. So I just want to say thank you to them, not just for their lives and their legacies, but what they've meant to me in this book project. So thank you to all of you for coming, and I'll turn it back over.
So I'm going to say one more thing. Let's hear it for the author.
Well, that really was one thing.
We're hungry.
That's a first. Okay, so, once again, thank you, Mary Ellen Pethel, Teresa Phillips, and Betty Wiseman for being here. I'll be the official ender with something that you said, that women have been doing things forever. We just didn't notice or we didn't document it. And that's when I want to invite you to go upstairs to a lovely exhibit that is documented of the early Vanderbilt Lady Commodores. It's post-Teresa, but her colleagues are in there. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about this exhibit. Is part of our special collections is the archives of the Nashville Banner, which was a daily newspaper that shut down in the 90s, which we can whole other conversation about the death of newspapers and documentation. And Mary Ellen is talking about, we've been talking about this book for a year and something, and we've been wanting to do this exhibit for a year, because it's when we originally found a couple of random negatives and a couple of photographs that had never been published or printed, when staff photographers were just sent out to photograph anything and everything that their editors told them to. And so there's a series of staff photographers who would go out to the basketball games, and we found this cache from early Vanderbilt. And it's beautiful, and I need a date, because when did half court stop?
High school, 1979, but colleges, as soon as, Tennessee was the one of the last two states in the country to go to full court basketball.
What year?
1979.
Okay, so all of these ladies upstairs are playing full court, and it's tremendous. So please, I invite you to go up there. We have some lovely food and beverages. We can continue, non-alcoholic, I should say. Please, because we would love to continue these conversations. Our panelists will be up there to meet you all, take photos, and talk some more. And you can see them. And there's lots of fun games to play with these photographs. Count the Band-Aids, count the bruises. These women are crushing it upstairs. So please, if you could go upstairs now to the exhibit, and we'll join you up there shortly. Thank you.